This was the main reason of the interest showed by the Russians in trying to control the DGI, because the Cubans could work far more easily than the Soviets.
Weren't the weather people aware that they were being used by the Soviets in some way?
No, they view the Cubans as being the vanguard of the international communist revolution. Now, the vanguard essentially means that the Cubans are at the very tip of the spear. They're the leadership. The Russians are being used by the Cubans. Now, this is the Weatherman's rationalization of this interaction between the Soviets and the Cubans. The Cubans said, you've got to become active. You've got to start doing things. And planning a national action to protest the beginning of the Chicago 8 trial and to commemorate the riots during the Democratic National Convention of '68, and to protest the war in Vietnam is not action. Action requires that you confront the system violently. So when the Weathermen got back from Cuba, they changed the national action to the Days of Rage.
The Days of Rage in October 1969 was an attack on the city of Chicago and its police department. For 4 days, anti-war protesters, urged on by agitators of the Weathermen, rioted in the streets, engaging in violent confrontations and pitched battles with the police. Quebec during the 1960s was rocked by terrorist bombings and confrontations between the police and French-Canadian separatist demonstrators supporting the FLQ. DGI contacts within revolutionary organizations like the FLQ had built an international terrorist ring.
It was late March or early April of 1970. I was in Buffalo, New York. The FOCO there consisted of 5 people. Bill Ayers and Naomi Jaffe were 2 of those people. Bill and Naomi left and went to Canada. Where at in Canada, I don't know, to meet with members of the Quebec Liberation Front with the objective of establishing closer ties with them and cooperating in actions, if possible, on both sides of the border. And they also received, it was either $2,000 or $3,000 from the Quebec Liberation Front that had been sent from Cuba for the Weathermen.
There was an attempt in 1965 by a group of blacks who had gone to Cuba under my auspices to blow up the Statue of Liberty.
The Black Liberation Front, which had been formed in Cuba in 1964, was the prime mover behind this plot. The bombing was prevented, however, when the police recovered the explosives from their hiding place in the Bronx. Amongst those arrested was Michel Duclos, a member of the French-Canadian separatist organization which provided the explosives to the Cuban-trained extremists. She pleaded guilty to illegally transporting dynamite.
We know that the Weatherman underground organization went to Cuba and utilized the same kinds of techniques that we utilized. These people did engage in direct bombing and killing in the United States. So I fear it.
And yet, most of them haven't been heard from for a long, long time.
That's right, but they're still out there. They're underground. And the question is, over a long period of time, what does it take to activate them?
The biggest Cuban intelligence efforts against the United States do not take place in North America. It is in the Caribbean and Central America where the Cuban DGI, backed by the Soviet KGB, are actively assisting revolutionary movements hostile to the United States.
we will win. Cuba, Jamaica, united we will win. Cuba, Jamaica, united.
In 1978, the government of the Caribbean island of Grenada was replaced by a Marxist regime led by Morris Bishop.
The government of the criminal dictator Eric M. Gary has been overthrown. All police stations are hereby ordered to put up a white flag as a symbol of surrender.
One by one, the governments that have been called right-wing dictatorships are being attacked and replaced by left-wing dictatorships financed by the Cubans.
Brother Morris Bishop, the long night of terror, the long night of repression and hardship has ended.
In Grenada, one of the first acts of the new government was to bring in Cubans to build a new airport. The airport, like the island itself, has military importance to the Cubans and ultimately to the Soviets. Grenada's proximity to the Venezuelan and Middle Eastern oil tanker routes to the U.S. make it an important strategic location. And in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas overthrew the regime of Anastasia Somoza, over 3,000 Cubans moved in immediately after the revolution. On the first anniversary of their takeover, the new government staged a celebration for visiting guests, like Fidel Castro, whose ambassadors to Nicaragua, López Diaz, and to Grenada, Torres Rizo, are top DGI officers. One of the speakers was Morris Bishop of Grenada.
In 1981, we will be able to speak not just of revolutionary Cuba.
Ya podamos hablar no solo de la Cuba revolucionaria,
Not just of revolutionary
no
Nicaragua,
solo de la Nicaragua revolucionaria,
but also of revolutionary El Salvador,
sino también de un El Salvador
and
revolucionario,
revolutionary Guatemala,
de una
and Honduras.
Guatemala y un Honduras revolucionario.
El Salvador, Guatemala, Puerto Rico. One after the other, the revolutionary movements of the islands and the Central American nations are being assisted by the Cubans, and behind them, the Soviets. Puerto Rico is an important area for Cuban activities. Electronically linked with Navy installations on the U.S. mainland, Puerto Rico is crucial as a submarine tracking base. Using top-secret undersea monitoring equipment, Americans are able to keep track of Soviet submarine actions on the entire Atlantic coastline. In April 1980, 10 FALN Puerto Rican revolutionaries were arrested outside Chicago, Illinois. With them was a van filled with explosives and arms. They were convicted on February 11, 1981, of seditious conspiracy for a wave of bomb blasts that have killed 5 people and wounded at least 100 others.
Does Castro run the Puerto Rican movement in the United States?
Sí,
Yes,
conozco de muchas operaciones
I know of many operations
que se hicieron a través del centro de Nueva York,
that were done through the center of New York,
que donde se les dio dinero o se les ha dado dinero,
where they received money,
explosivos,
explosives,
armas
weapons,
y reclutamientos que se han hecho
recruitment that
para
was
trabajar
made
en Estados Unidos.
for them to work in the United States.
Soviet naval activities in the Caribbean and the Atlantic are of increasing strategic significance, as is Havana's harbor to the Soviet fleet. In addition to surface ships, submarines are a vital part of a growing armada. For submarines are hard to detect as they lie off America's shores armed with nuclear missiles. Fishing ships are another part of the Soviet armada off the shores of North America. Often used for electronic intelligence gathering, the fishing ships also serve as shields, protecting the submarines below from the radar and sonar of the anti-submarine forces of the Americans and Canadians. It was on one of these ships that Boris Stern served.
The submarine kept contact with my ship When we came near Newfoundland, the captain had a radiogram on the submarine location. My ship, the fishing ship, covered the submarine from the airplanes above.
These ships have also been used to provide Irish terrorists with arms.
My ship, this is a fishing ship and not a military ship. At 2 o'clock at night, as my ship came near Ireland, 2 boats with Irish people came to the ship, and the KGB officer on our boat, Misha Boulanger, gave them a very big box, we think, of arms.
Soviet espionage efforts in North America are designed to assist the capabilities of their submarines in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Some of these efforts have seemed trivial, yet the results are still affecting Canadian and American security. This Canadian civil servant was targeted by the KGB. He was at first offered small payments for unclassified information, but the promise of larger sums soon led to his acquiring more sensitive strategic documents, such as classified naval maps of old wrecks that lay on the bottom of the Atlantic along the Canadian coastline. William Kelly was head of the security service of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at the time.
Well, now, these maps were of extreme importance to the Russians, and particularly for their submarine commanders, because when there was the patrol boats of the Canadian Navy on the surface, the submarine would know it, and to avoid detection, that's all the submarine had to do was settle down alongside of a wreck, so that when the patrol boat above would make contact with some sounding device with the bottom of the ocean with some metal down there, he'd look on a map and he'd say, oh yes, this is just a wreck, and he'd move on, leaving the submarine to continue its patrol safely.
In the 1950s, an obscure, unassuming photographer lived alone in Brooklyn, operating his business from a storefront. Rudolf Abel attracted little attention until it was revealed he headed a Soviet spy ring operating in America. He was caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Do you feel that you received a fair trial?
I would refer that question to my attorney, Mr. Donovan.
Our American system of trial by jury is the fairest system in the world.
In the world of espionage, Abel was known as an illegal, a spy who lives under an assumed name and is controlled by Department S of the KGB. It is Department S that selects the agents who quietly blend into the societies of other nations and lead seemingly normal lives, while secretly carrying out orders passed to them from Moscow. This is part of a television program about the Black Riots in America in 1968. It was produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The end credits are interesting in that the sound man on the film crew, Rudy Herman, was a KGB illegal. He was Colonel Rudolf Herman, whose cover story bears many similarities to that of Colonel Abel. Both men entered the U.S. through Canada and both pursued careers in the film industry. Rudolf Herman went first to Toronto, where he lived quietly with his family in a small house on Sutherland Avenue. He was ordered to take a job with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. In 1969, Colonel Herman was ordered by Moscow to move from Toronto to New York and set up as a photographer while he organized his network of espionage in the United States. His appearance has been disguised and his voice electronically altered.
Oh yes, for the past 25 years I was getting every weekend on 2 days a radio transmission.
When Herman was finally caught by the FBI, Richard Kinsey was deputy chief of the Soviet desk at FBI headquarters in Washington.
He had been sent on meetings, had been sent to meet people in Canada for one thing, had he not?
Yes, he had.
Do you know anything about why he was sent up to Canada?
I'd prefer not to go into that.
Colonel Herman traveled to Quebec City, where he went to Laval University and met with a Canadian economics professor named Hugh Hambleton.
Hello, are you Professor Hambleton?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Hugh Hambleton is a specialist in petroleum economics. He has been named by Colonel Herman as a long-time trusted source. Professor Hambleton met Herman many times and supplied him with information. This interview was filmed with hidden cameras.
How did you meet Rudy Herman?
I came at Laval, as I remember. I mean, I'm pretty honest, because
when did he come to Laval?
I don't know the guy, it's your faces. I'm trying to, I'm being honest. I don't remember exactly. I just know I knew him at Laval. I certainly didn't know anywhere else.
Well,
Herman met Hambleton at least a dozen times in Canada, and in 1975 they met in Haiti, where Hambleton passed Herman information about the Chinese embassy.
He must have come there to see you.
There was a top-secret FBI RCMP operation targeting Professor Hambleton and Colonel Herman, codenamed Red Pepper.
What was the reason for the meetings between Herman and Hambleton?
Again, you're getting into what is still a sensitive area. I can say this, that Colonel Herman was ordered to contact Hambleton by his own admission, by his superiors in Moscow. But beyond that, I would not like to go.
Professor Hambleton is not as naive as he might appear. During World War II, he worked for Free French Intelligence. After the war, he worked for Canadian intelligence in Germany. But then, in the late 1940s, he met in Ottawa with Vladimir Borodin, a senior recruiter for Soviet intelligence.
But you met Borodino in 48, did you not?
Maybe it's possible. I guess so.
From 1956 to 1961, Hambleton had top-secret security clearance when he worked for NATO in Paris. Professor Hambleton has also made 2 trips to Cuba. He met with a leading Cuban intelligence officer, Ricardo Escartin, who has recently been expelled from the United States for espionage activities. In 1975, he made a trip to Moscow.
How come you went to the Soviet Union now? I didn't go. But you didn't go to the Soviet Union at all? What information?
Later, he confessed to making a 10 to 12-day trip to the Soviet Union in 1975, where, in his own words, he was under considerable pressure from the KGB. Subsequently, the RCMP raided Hambleton's Ottawa residence and seized a shortwave radio and code books. Professor Hambleton was just one of Colonel Herman's contacts. Herman has provided the FBI with significant leads on Soviet agents operating in North America. His espionage activities were of the utmost importance.
My job would be without any importance. I would definitely not spend such a long time in the United States. And besides, during my years of service, I was several times promoted.
Now Colonel Herman is somewhere in hiding in the United States, an illegal who came to the surface. Carlo Tuomi is another example of an illegal sent to America by Moscow.
You were known as an illegal. What exactly is an illegal?
Illegal is a foreign agent who enters the country with forged documents and establishes himself as a citizen of that country. Little by little acquires all the documentation, the driver's license, birth certificates, credit card, and so on. Finds a job, gets all the credentials and all the background, future references as a bona fide citizen of that country. For instance, in this case...
That's what happened to you, right?
That's right.
And you got all this from Moscow when you were trained as a spy at a spy school in Moscow?
That's right. That's right. That was a major part of my schooling.
In case of North America, Canada, and the United States, what is much more dangerous are the so-called illegals who are smuggled into these countries. That is, people who come here under a new identity, and they live as citizens of these countries, and they would start operating really in case of war between the Soviet Union and the United States, for example, or in the time of a very serious crisis when, for example, the diplomatic relations would be broken.
In case of war, I would be, among other illegals, the only means by which the Soviet Union could get any military intelligence from the United States, because all their diplomatic means, all their open means would be cut off.
And at the time you were with Czech intelligence, there were actually agents sent over here.
Yes, that's right.
Who were to just sit and wait.
That's right, yeah. Very many.
The Soviets used many routes to secretly place their illegals. The Soviet fishing fleets, which regularly stop at North American ports, have often provided the KGB with a secure means of landing their spies. Boris Stern was a photojournalist with the Soviet fishing fleet and recalls an incident he once witnessed.
One time, we left a man in St. John's, Newfoundland. He had been kept in hiding on my boat. I thought, the other people on our boat thought, he was an illegal being dropped into Canada.
You believe that this was a case of dropping a spy off in Canada?
Yes.
Within the KGB, there is another department which controls illegals. Department V conducts what are known within the KGB by the macabre description wet affairs, assassinations, sabotage, and other violent acts. It is the department that takes care of the dirty work of the KGB. Until he defected to the West, Arkady Shevchenko was the senior Soviet at the UN.
That has been the department which operates in the secret, which is even unbelievable for the Soviet secret society.
Have you ever known of any Department V people in North America?
Yes, it was in New York, in the Soviet mission in New York in the middle of the 60s. And one of my friends who happened also to be working with the KGB, he told me, look, this man looks so quiet, calm, and even respectable as someone. If you look at him, you would never believe that what he is really doing, and to what branch or to what department of the KGB he himself belonged. That is the most sinister thing in the world, which he is doing.
This man was a member of Department V. He was trained in Moscow and sent to Canada, where explosives had already been hidden for his use.
Well, then fine, let's do an interview. Okay, well...
He refused to be interviewed. After months of work, the Norfolk Investigative Unit traced him to a small town where he now lives in hiding.
You were in the KGB, and you were sent over here to North America to engage in espionage acts, and you decided for one reason or another not to go through with this. And, however...
Sabotka was sent to Edmonton in Western Canada, where he spent 4 years working and acquiring all the credentials of a normal Canadian citizen. In 1965, the call came from Moscow. He was ordered to go to a Toronto suburb and observe a house and its occupants. The house was at the time inhabited by one of the most famous defectors of all, Igor Guzenko, who fled the Soviet embassy in 1945. His defection led to the uncovering of Soviet spy rings in North America and was a severe setback for Soviet espionage. 20 years after it occurred, Department V of the KGB was still sending its agents looking for him.
If he comes so close, my life, of course, was very, very... And if I open door, incidentally, I never open door. Never open door in my house.
Possibly went to the wrong house?
I don't know, really don't know. So he could be my come in the wrong house or something, but I never myself opened the door.
Where we think
Sabotka had been activated by KGB agent Oleg Komenko, who at the time was working as a counselor at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa and was traveling with the Russian Moiseyev Ballet on a North American tour. Strategically placed in Western Canada, Sabotka was ordered to plan, in the event of war, the destruction of the key refining and pumping stations that supply much of North America with its energy. Edmonton is also a center of top-secret cold weather testing for Canadian and American forces, and Sabotka was ordered to find all he could about these facilities. He had other important missions, one of which was to act as a link between Moscow and a KGB sabotage network in North America.
I would presume it was no accident that you were sent out to Edmonton with oil refineries and all that sort of thing. It was not an accident you were sent there?
No.
And I would presume that
They had their plans on that I must really go.
This house off Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. is an office of the Soviet military attachés. Some of these men have legitimate business there. However, most military attachés in reality are spies of the GRU, operating closely with the KGB. Working under the Ministry of Defense, the GRU specifically confines its activities to espionage in military matters. The first chief directorate of the KGB, however, has ultimate authority over the GRU espionage networks. During World War II, Carlo Tuomi was recruited into the Soviet military intelligence. He was born in Michigan of Finnish parents who left America and went to the Soviet Union while he was still a boy. His boyhood knowledge of America made him a natural candidate to become a Soviet spy sent back to the U.S. as an illegal.
I was trained to collect military information about the United States Armed Forces with special emphasis on naval affairs and shipment of arms, locations of docks and warehouses, specifically in the harbor of New York, where these arms were being stored and handled, and from where they being shipped to foreign countries.
In other words, you were a spy.
That's true. I studied the United States in general, the geography, economy, government, armed forces. The woman who was my English instructor had been born in Brooklyn, was a graduate of Columbia University, had an excellent command of modern American English.
What about the American culture? I mean, how were you trained so that you would feel at home in America once you got there from Moscow?
Well, the basic way of getting me into touch with American reality and culture was by showing American movies. From movies, you can learn quite a bit how people behave, how they dress, how they talk. And so that's a very important way to train an agent who is to operate in that particular country. One of the agents, he was not an instructor, but he was a more administrative personnel. He took me to a storehouse which looked like really like an American clothing store, where they picked the clothing the right size. Well, the suits and overcoat had to be adjusted.
Were these American clothes that were shipped over to the Soviet Union?
They were American clothes. A lot of them were from Macy's. I entered the United States by train. I took a train from Montreal to Chicago. So Canada was used as a stepping ground to enter the United States.
Is Canada a usual way that the Soviets put spies in the United States?
It is considered the easiest way.
Soviet agents in the U.S. went to great lengths to create what is called his legend or his cover story.
This legend, for the later years where I was employed, especially in New York and in Milwaukee, the Soviet diplomatic intelligence agents had done a lot of groundwork. They had studied these different places. They took pictures from the outside. They had even some pictures taken inside of these places.
In Moscow, Tuomi was shown these photographs of a lumber company in the Bronx where he was supposed to have worked, and of a General Electric plant where he was also supposed to have been employed.
They have been taken by Soviet diplomatic personnel, in most cases working for the UN. Instructions for me originated in Moscow and were sent in coded form to Soviet intelligence agents who were posing as UN diplomats. And they were processed by these diplomat spies and then sent to me by letter with a New York postmark.
Did you ever get money from Soviet officials working with or for the UN?
Definitely. They left the drops, magnetic containers like this. I usually received $3,000 at a time. It was always in advance. Once I received $5,400, which was in advance. This container.
How was that container used?
Well, the top of the container is magnetized, and then it is left at a predetermined place, which is called a drop, under a railroad bridge, under an elevated, inside a support of a bridge or something, and it was never lost. This was a very reliable gadget.
And this was used all over New York City? Or in
Yes.
places in New York City?
Yes, I had 4 different drops.
As this FBI photo shows, Tuomi met with his Soviet handler, Alexei Galkin. He then took a cover job at Tiffany's Jewelers in New York. Beneath this subway bridge in the Bronx was one of the drop points he had for messages. Another was the Hudson River train line. Another was under this railroad bridge in Queens at 69th Street. Another on this telephone pole in Yonkers. Once he was well established, Tuomi was ordered to take a job where he could carry out surveillance of the docks at the port of New York. Eventually, he was caught by the FBI and became a double agent.
When you were caught by the FBI, did you try to signal your Soviet handlers at the UN or in Moscow that you had been caught?
Not immediately, because I couldn't. It was in my mind, but I couldn't do it immediately. I did send a signal to the center, which is Soviet intelligence, military intelligence headquarters in Moscow. I sent a signal 3 months after I had been caught by the FBI.
How did you send the signal? What means?
I sent the signal by inserting it in message which I wrote under the control of the FBI. But I got away from the FBI agents for a few minutes to write that message using the washroom.
And was this a hidden writing technique that you used?
Yes, I had an extra sheet of chemically treated paper, which was used for secret writing, and I used that in the washroom. There was an internal struggle inside of me. I was torn apart. I was pro-Soviet. I believed in a Soviet system. And here I was working for the FBI, the enemy of my country. I just couldn't live with the idea of betraying the Soviet Union.
Are you still pro-Soviet?
Oh, definitely not.
So what changed you? I don't understand how you've changed, or why you've changed.
That's a very long process, something that doesn't happen overnight.
This is the KGB Blue Book, where Tuomi is listed under his Soviet name. In it, he is named as an enemy of the fatherland. But even a spy caught and turned finds it difficult to be parted from his country.
Because of the family.
Your
family that you had over in the Soviet Union?
Yes, I had a wife and I had 3 children. Otherwise, coming back to the United States, that's the greatest thing that ever happened to me.
Have you ever heard from your former wife or your children?
No, I haven't heard from them since 1963.
On November 15, 1979, Sir Anthony Blunt, a distinguished British art historian and the art advisor to the Queen, was stripped of his knighthood.
What happens now?
A shocked House of Commons had been told by the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, that Blunt had been a Soviet agent. While at Cambridge University in the 30s, he acted as a talent spotter for the Soviets, and later, while a member of British intelligence, he continued to pass information to the Russians. By remaining silent about his friends involved in spying, he was directly responsible for exposing British agents and operations.
In the mid-1930s, it seemed to me and to many of my contemporaries that the Communist Party and Russia constituted the only firm bulwark against fascism, since the Western democracies were taking an uncertain and compromising attitude towards Germany. I was persuaded by Guy Burgess that I could best serve the cause of anti-fascism by joining him in his work for the Russians. This was a case of political conscience against loyalty to country. I chose conscience. When later I realized the true facts about Russia, I was prevented from taking any action by personal loyalty. I could not denounce my friends.
Cambridge University in the 1930s, where young men were recruited to rise up quietly to the highest ranks of the British establishment while secretly working for the Soviets. These were the moles. The most notorious was Kim Philby, who rose to be a senior officer in MI6, the British intelligence agency. As liaison officer with the CIA, Philby was well placed to relay vital Western secrets to the Soviets. Since 1963, Philby has lived in Moscow and is a colonel in the KGB. His tip-offs were to cost many Western agents their lives. Donald MacLean and Guy Burgess were working for the Foreign Office, and both were friends of Philby. They also worked for the Soviets until they fled to Moscow in 1952. As head of the American department, MacLean had access to these top-secret briefs of President Truman's assurances to then British Prime Minister Attlee that American threats to use the atomic bomb in the Korean War would never be carried out. This valuable information went straight to MacLean's Soviet handlers. But there were many Americans also involved in similar activities. In the 1930s, Nathaniel Weil was one of thousands of young Americans who decided that the fascism of Hitler's Germany was the true enemy and that communism was the answer. He became a secret party member who took his orders from the Soviets while working for the U.S. government.
We were to rise into positions of as much power as we could in the government, to influence the government in a socialist or communist direction. And so that in the event of our victory, there would be trained men to take over major governmental tasks.
Seen here at a government conference in the 30s, Nathaniel Weil was just one of many Americans secretly working for the Soviets within the U.S. government.
We were to sever all connections with known communists abruptly and instantly. We were not to express left-wing views under any circumstances. And if we saw people who seemed to us likely recruits, we would bring the name before the group, where this would be discussed. But we would have no further contact with that person. In other words, a decision would be made, and then some entirely different person would make the approach, thus preserving the clandestine nature of the cell.
Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury during the war years, was entrusted with the responsibility for all Treasury policy bearing on foreign relations. He was also a Soviet mole. In his sensitive position, he was not only well placed to pass on intelligence material, but to influence policy decisions as well. Under Soviet instructions, White drafted a plan for Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's closest advisors, which was presented to the Allies gathered at the Quebec Conference in September 1944. Dismissed as ill-conceived by Winston Churchill and the chiefs of staff, the Morgenthau Plan called for the total deindustrialization of Germany after the war, under the pretext of permanently disabling German militarism. It received wide publicity, particularly in Germany, where Adolf Hitler faced opposition from his own officer corps and had recently survived an unsuccessful bomb plot on his life from amongst their numbers. In the face of advancing Allied armies, German propagandists called for determined opposition as the only alternative to the grim future offered by the Morgenthau Plan. Germany was to be shattered no matter what. An early end to the war would have interfered with the Soviets' plans. In late 1944, their forces were still far to the east. But by May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, all of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Romania were in their sphere of influence. Harry Dexter White's influence on behalf of the Soviets was not restricted to the European theater of battle. In China, the Soviets were supporting Mao Zedong in his battle against both the Japanese and the nationalist Chinese forces of Chiang Kai-shek. In 1943, President Roosevelt agreed to lend Chiang's armies $500 million for their fight against the Japanese and agreed to immediately deliver $200 million in gold. But White's personal control over the Chinese currency stabilization program enabled him to ignore the declared policy of Roosevelt and Congress and delay the gold shipments. The Chinese economy continued to collapse, paving the way for the eventual takeover by the communists. There were others. Lachlan Curry was President Roosevelt's personal emissary to the nationalist Chinese. Yet he, too, was secretly working with the Soviets to destabilize nationalist China. But it was not until a few years later that a shocked nation learned the extent of Soviet penetration when Elizabeth Bentley, a Soviet spy and courier, testified before a U.S. Senate committee.
We were getting information from the Army, particularly the Air Corps, from the Treasury, from the State Department, from the OSS, from the CIAA, the Rockefeller Committee, from the OWI.
Treasury?
Oh, yeah. Didn't I name the treasury? Yes.
The War Production Board?
Yes, from the War Production Board, from the War Manpower Commission. I think that about covers it, Senator.
All right. Now will you describe the kind of information that you were getting out of these departments?
She revealed that she had passed to the Soviets inside White House information that Lachlan Curry had given to her.
He did pass on the information that the American government was just about to break the Soviet code.
And what happened then?
I relayed that to the Russians. They wanted to know which code, which I couldn't obviously tell them.
But Elizabeth Bentley named Harry Dexter White as the man who did the most damage. In his appearance before a U.S. congressional committee, he denied he had ever been a communist. 2 days later, he died of a heart attack.
All these people were accused by former Soviet spy masters of being espionage agents of the Soviet government. So we must assume that today the situation is worse since all of our security is broken down.
Soviet espionage was the operation to acquire the information needed to build the atomic bomb. In 1953, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed for relaying atomic information to the Soviets. But by far the most important secrets were obtained from highly placed agents working directly on the top-secret Manhattan Project. British diplomat Donald MacLean photographed classified documents at Atomic Energy headquarters for the Russians. Klaus Fuchs, a German scientist, infiltrated the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico. These two were the key operatives passing the latest developments to the Soviets. Fuchs served less than 10 years in a British jail and left for a hero's welcome and a top scientific post in East Germany. Scientific espionage is a critical area of operations for the KGB. Department T uses business fronts, trade delegations, and exchange programs as covers to acquire America's scientific and industrial knowledge. Many American campuses are host to large numbers of Soviet scientists. The universities are often the site of secret scientific research in areas of industrial and military significance. For 10 years, Professor Robert Burns of Indiana University ran the academic exchange program between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Well, for what purposes have Soviets been in this country? Well, very clearly to get access to American science and technology. Very often to get access to particular fields in which they are especially weak. One of my colleagues in the 60s made a study of Kosygin speech, identifying their shortcomings, and a list of Soviet scholars who came to the United States in the next few years. The list dovetailed perfectly. This year, the Soviets tried to send 19 people in very highly classified fields in order to get around the restrictions that we placed on exporting equipment after the invasion of Afghanistan.
An examination of the list of U.S. scholars in the Soviet Union is revealing. It shows without exception that the topics studied are all in the humanities, history, literature, and the arts.
The Soviets do not allow us to study the 20th century. In all of the 22 years of the exchange programs, we have not sent anyone to the Soviet Union to study the things in which many Americans are most interested.
But the Soviets studying in the U.S. are enrolled in virtually every strategically important area of research being carried out. Lasers, microcircuitry, and ceramics. All subjects that have applications to spacecraft, missiles, and weapons aimed at the United States. But while the Soviet scholars are welcomed with academic courtesy in North America, the same is not true of Western scholars in the Soviet Union.
I made a study of the exchanges from 1958 through 1975, and something like 20% of the American participants in the major program were affected by the KGB in one way or another. Obviously followed, in some cases harassed and intimidated, in a few cases seduced and put under pressures to provide information about fellow students or about American embassy officials.
One victim of the KGB's manipulation of exchange programs was Canadian professor Johann Königstein, targeted because of his expertise with laser technology. Department T of the KGB often works closely with the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, whose objective is to acquire military technology. While visiting the Soviet Union, Professor Königstein was involved with a female operative of the KGB, Galina Nusinova. Returning to Ottawa, he met with Yuri Usati of the GRU, who convinced him to take a laser along on his next visit without filing the proper export authorization forms.
Because, in my opinion, it was like taking a book with me or something like that.
Because if you took it over,
it was,
because why did you take it over?
Well, to do these experiments, they had to be done. I didn't want to do all that routine kind of research.
Not all technology is gained by academic exchanges. Many North American companies are approached on a commercial basis by the KGB. HEICO, a Vancouver firm, built the Pisces, the most advanced deep-sea submersible in the world. As the Soviets lagged far behind the West in deep-sea technology, they were anxious to obtain the submersible, so HEICO was approached by a KGB agent named Segalovich working for Department T. But HEICO was forbidden to export its product to the Soviet Union because the Pisces utilized secret welding techniques used on U.S. atomic submarines. In order to avoid the export ban, the submersible was sent part by part to Switzerland, where it was assembled and tested off the coast of Italy. It was then sent to the Soviet Union, giving them instant parity with the West. Department T of the KGB often devises intricate schemes using third-party nationals to act as middlemen to illegally avoid export bans placed on strategic technology. Peter Virag, a Montreal lawyer, recently entered into an export deal involving sophisticated computer equipment. Aware the equipment would require special export licenses if destined for other countries, Virag arranged for the equipment to be initially exported to Canada. He then illegally re-exported the computer equipment to European centers, where his partner sent it on to final destinations behind the Iron Curtain. This man, Marc-André de Geiter, is a Belgian with business ties in the Soviet Union. Through bribery, he tried to obtain a computer source code valuable to the Soviet military because it simplifies computer operations, thus reducing the size of the computer required. But the transfer of American technology to the Soviets is not only accomplished by the subterfuges of the KGB. Much of it is done openly, for as Lenin had predicted, when the time comes to hang the capitalists, they will be eager to sell us the rope. A Texas company has sold the Soviets devices known as array processors, which are now being used on Soviet killer submarines. The array processors interpret underwater signals and target the locations of other submarines. In Corona, California, the principals of Spar Optical Research Incorporated were convicted of exporting copper water-cooled mirrors to Europe for reshipment to the Soviet Union. These mirrors are essential to particle beam and laser research, and the Soviet military is now closer to achieving the ability to destroy vital communications satellites. A New England firm in 1972 sold the Soviets their product, one of the most advanced ball bearing manufacturing machines in the world. The miniature ball bearings are essential to the successful launch of multiple warheads from a single missile. Americans have also provided the Soviets with the technology critical to the guidance systems that greatly increase the accuracy of Soviet missiles. Dr. Miles Kostick is a Washington-based defense analyst.
The acquisition of American inertial guidance technology, which consists of 3 different technologies, has enabled Soviets to bridge a tremendous gap in the circular error probable, namely precision of on-target delivery of their missiles. When they started, they were about 3 miles of the target, and this was not so long ago, about 8 years ago.
But now the Soviet missiles are accurate to within 600 feet of American missile silos. In order to overcome this increased Soviet accuracy, the MX missile system has been proposed. It is the largest construction program in the history of mankind, with missiles on movable carriers.
And that new missile, which is the MX missile system, will cost us $60 to $100 billion, strictly to offset the advantages which Soviet acquired through their scientific and industrial espionage in the United States.
Yuri Bezmenov is a former KGB agent.
Follows the statement of a very ancient Chinese philosopher, Sun Tzu, who was born 500 years BC, before Jesus Christ, who said something to the effect that fighting war on a battlefield is the most stupid and primitive way of fighting a war. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in your enemy's country, be it moral traditions, religion, respect to your authority and leaders, cultural traditions, anything. Put white against black, old against young, I don't know, wealthy against poor, and so on. Doesn't matter. As long as it disturbs society, as long as it cuts the moral fiber of a nation, it's good. And then you just take this country, when everything is subverted, when the country is disoriented and confused, when it is demoralized and then destabilized, then the crisis will come.
Within the KGB is a department that specializes in planting false stories and forged documents to distort others' perception of reality. It is the department that deals in disinformation. Department A of the KGB set up and controls the disinformation department of Czech intelligence. Ladislav Bittman was deputy director of that department when he was with Czech intelligence.
Disinformation can have a variety of forms. It's basically an information deliberately misleading that is leaked through a variety of channels to the opponent to deceive him, to deceive the decision makers in the United States or Germany or Britain, or it can be a disinformation to deceive the public opinion around the world or in a specific country.
You got to be fairly good at this when you were with Czech intelligence, didn't you?
Unfortunately, I have to admit, yes.
One of Bittman's audacious schemes was to recover phony Nazi storage chests from a Czechoslovakian lake. The chests were filled with genuine Gestapo and SS documents supplied by the KGB and specifically chosen to rekindle animosity towards the Germans decades after World War II.
And I was a member of the diving team, and when I talked with few people in the service about this, we came to the conclusion that this is a very good opportunity to play a dirty game against West Germany, that we would actually put something on the bottom of the lakes and make it a big discovery. So we prepared several German chests. Supposedly they were thrown into the lakes by Germans who were just fleeing Czechoslovak territory.
The cases were brought from the bottom in front of television cameras. The documents were then displayed in an elaborate press conference aimed at weakening the solidarity of the NATO allies.
It was quite successful in Italy, in France, in Austria. The press of these countries published them, and basically the tone was anti-German. Look what these German bastards did to us during the war. And there are so many who are still living in Germany.
Who are the major targets of the disinformation campaign that you were waging? I understand there was 2 or 3 major targets.
Well, the target number 1 is, of course, the United States. It is called the enemy number 1, or the main enemy.
It's always used in that word.
That is the official term for the United States. Then the second major target was the NATO alliance. And the objective was to work toward the dissolution of NATO, with the hope that after some few years, the tension within the organization would reach such a stage, such a level that NATO would stop existing.
NATO was formed in post-war Europe as a political and military alliance against the Soviets. But its most effective opposition now comes not from Soviet armies, but from Soviet disinformation, which continually attempts to turn one NATO ally against another. Each one of these papers appears to be a leaked U.S. government document, but they're all forgeries designed to sow dissension within NATO. This document made damaging remarks supposedly from former President Carter about both Greece and Turkey. This is a phony intelligence report on European left-wingers. This is a forged NATO document claiming to devise ways of getting support for the neutron bomb. A forged confidential State Department memo advocating economic espionage by America on her own allies. Many forgeries have been directed against Anwar Sadat, a confidential U.S. memo claiming his time is up, or false reports on former Vice President Mondale's remarks that neither Sadat nor Begin are viable leaders. There have been forgeries released to show American suppression of Islam, the religion of its oil suppliers. Yet perhaps the most successful Soviet disinformation attack was on the KGB's main competition, the CIA. It began with an agreement in the mid-60s between the East German and Czech intelligence services.
The two disinformation departments, again under the supervision of the Soviets, decided to start a long-term operation against the CIA, making life as hard as possible for CIA. That is to label many American diplomats, politicians, cultural representatives abroad as CIA agents and paralyze their positions. Specifically in 1966, the first major operation was to prepare a book which is called Who is Who in CIA.
The book Who's Who in CIA was the beginning of the exposés that seriously undermined American intelligence capabilities for almost a decade. So powerful was the impact of this book that its imitators, like Philip Agee's Covert Action Information Bulletin, frequently refer to it as source material, as do other major news sources. It was used as a source in this ABC nightly news television broadcast in November 1980, claiming that the Reverend Jim Jones had a secret CIA associate before the Guyana massacre.
This man, Richard Dwyer, is the focal point of many of the questions surrounding the possible CIA involvement at Jonestown. He's a career diplomat who served in sensitive posts throughout the Mideast. 2 years ago, he was the deputy mission chief in Guyana. He is listed as a CIA agent in a publication that for years has specialized in such allegations. The CIA denies the accusation.
But it was Ladislav Bittman who was one of the real authors of Who's Who in CIA. And although it was not published under his name, the book received exactly the attention he hoped it would.
Shortly after coming to the United States, I found this book in many bookstores. I have it at home. And for example, it was quoted by the Covert Action Bulletin, or
is this AG's group, the group?
Yes, that's right.
It's
one of the major sources of information about CIA man. Of course, that's ironic because that is a communist disinformation.
Konstantin Hanf is a New York-based journalist for Polish-language newspapers in North America. When he decided to expose communist agents in the U.S., the long reach of the KGB influenced his life.
1976, we started a wave of exposure of Soviet and Polish communist intelligence network, especially here in New York. We exposed agents mostly working around the United Nations.
What agents were these? Who were they working for?
For the KGB.
Any?
Polish Communist Intelligence Service, which is actually nothing but an arm of KGB too.
Shortly after his exposés of the KGB in New York, Hanf's stories were published in a heavily ethnic area in Winnipeg, several thousand miles to the west, by the weekly newspaper Czas, the Polish Times. In July 1978, on a day the paper had not planned to publish, a bizarre edition of the weekly was put into circulation with articles and semi-nude photos designed to offend its conservative and older readership.
It was done in a very clever way, because the look of it was exactly the same as we would have printed, but some things struck us right away. For example, right on the front page is that beautifully breasted women, which we wouldn't have never put into a paper simply for different reasons, But our readers are mostly middle-aged people who would never dream of doing anything like that, Inside the paper, we have a picture of one of our correspondents in the uniform of a German Wehrmacht, and the letter supposedly written by a Jewish writer referring to our journalist, a contributor to the paper, Mr. Hanf, as a war criminal, Nazi war criminal. The funny part of it is that when the war ended, he was about 18 years old, and yet they said that he was high-ranking officer, that he has killed so many Jews and this and that, And there's another article portraying Mr. Hanf as an agent of, you take it, KGB, CIA, FBI, everything under the sun.
It has become a classic case of Soviet bloc disinformation on a very personal level. The charges against Hanf were also made in a letter supposedly written by the Jewish Defense League of New York, and the letter was sent out to advertisers of the newspaper, informing them that Czas was harboring a Nazi war criminal.
I am Polish from my belief and from my birth and from my persuasion, I would say, but my father was a German, so my engagement in the German army was not incidental, actually, because...
How long were you in the German army, and just what did you do?
I was a regular soldier. I was drafted in March of 44.
March 1944?
Yes, when I was 17 and a half of age. And in February of 45, I was captured by the Soviets.
The accusing letter was revealed to be a forgery when the real Jewish Defense League examined this and declared it had not been written on their stationery, and also that they had never accused Mr. Hanf of any war crimes.
What effect would this have had on your readership? What effect did this have on your advertisers? I mean, what was this?
Well, obviously, I think the main aim was to stop Czas being published and have the same editorial policy as it was, since Mr. Mroczkowski took over. And they wanted, I'm sure, to create panic on the board of directors so that you would fire him and get some woolly-headed fellow, which would be a little bit softer on communism.
Yeah, there is a long-term plan and strategy how to frighten prominent exiles who are politically active, or organizations that are very anti-Soviet or anti-communist. And I have to admit that this is a relatively an easy thing to do. Why? Because most exiles, most refugees or immigrants have some kind of relations with the mother country, with the people, with the relatives there, and they can be even blackmailed, because imagine that you have a mother there and somebody comes and says, so if you don't cooperate, or if you continue speaking against us, your mother will have a very tough life, my dear friend.